The moment it happened, the string quartet in the far corner of the Grand Calloway Ballroom had just played the final note of a Chopin nocturne, and the sound dissolved into the kind of silence that only money can buy, thick, cushioned, certain. 200 guests an evening were stood in loose constellations across the marble floor, champagne flutes catching the chandelier light, their conversations a warm murmur of names and deals and carefully rehearsed laughter. At the center of it all, Edward Calloway stepped toward the gold-trimmed microphone on the low stage, straightening his cufflinks with the practiced ease of a man who had stood in front of crowds his entire adult life without once feeling small. The Calloway Foundation's annual gala was not merely a fundraiser. It was a declaration of power, of legacy, of everything the Calloway name had built over 4 decades of strategic brilliance and disciplined sacrifice. The ballroom of the Harrington Hotel had been transformed into something from a dream. Cascading white orchids on every table, candlelight doubling itself in the long mirrors along the east wall, the soft percussion of heels on marble, and the scent of something expensive and floral that made you feel, just by breathing it in, that the world was a generous place and you had earned your seat in it. Edward raised one hand in greeting, and the room quieted with the obedient grace of a well-trained audience. Then the voice came. "Daddy, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." It was so small, so impossibly small against the grandeur of the room. A child's voice, high and bright, and absolutely certain, cutting through the orchestrated silence like a single wrong note that somehow made everything else stop making sense. 200 heads turned at once. Champagne stilled in glasses. The string quartet lowered their bows. At the top of the 3 carpeted steps leading into the ballroom stood a boy. He was perhaps 6 years old, slight and dark-haired, wearing a white button-down shirt that was half untucked and slightly too large for his narrow shoulders. His hair was damp at the temples like he'd been running hard. His shoes, small brown leather ones, scuffed at the toes, were planted on the top step as if he had lost his courage at the last moment. But his arm was outstretched, his small finger pointing with the devastating precision of a child who has never learned to be indirect. He was pointing at Edward Calloway. "Daddy, it's you. I knew it was you." The silence that followed had texture. You could feel it pressing against your eardrums. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman's clutch purse hit the floor, and the small metallic sound was enormous. Edward stood at the microphone without moving. Without speaking, his expression arranged into something that no one in that room had ever seen on his face before. Not blankness, not confusion, something that lived just to the left of both. A kind of arrested stillness, as if every system inside him had simultaneously stopped to ask the same question. Then, from the service corridor that ran along the left wall, the narrow, white-painted hallway that guests were never meant to notice, the one that existed purely to keep the invisible machinery of the evening running, a woman appeared. She was wearing the uniform of the hotel's catering staff, a plain black dress, a white apron tied at the waist, dark hair pulled back tightly at the nape of her neck. Her hands were empty. She had been carrying a tray of canapés moments before, but it had slipped from her grip somewhere in the corridor when she heard the voice. And now those hands were reaching forward, shaking slightly, as she moved toward the boy at the top of the steps with the particular urgency of a mother whose worst fear is unfolding in slow motion. "Lucas," she whispered. Then louder, "Lucas, come here. Now." But Lucas was not looking at his mother. Lucas had eyes for only one thing in that glittering, bewildering room full of strangers in expensive clothes. His gaze was locked on Edward Calloway with a conviction that made several guests near the front instinctively step back, as if the child's certainty were its own kind of force. "Mama said not to bother you," Lucas called across the room, and his voice wobbled now, not with uncertainty, but with the effort of being brave. "But I saw your picture. Mama keeps it in the blue tin. You were laughing." He swallowed. "You look the same." The woman reached him then. She grabbed Lucas by the shoulders, not roughly, but with the contained urgency of someone trying to undo something that cannot be undone, and she pulled him against her hip, pressing his face into her apron. "I'm so sorry," she said, directing the words generally at the room, at Edward, at the air itself. "I'm so sorry. He followed me from he shouldn't be here. I'm sorry." She did not look at Edward Calloway. She could not, because if she looked at him, Everything she had spent 6 years carefully and quietly not thinking about would come flooding back all at once. The blue tin was real. The photograph was real. And the man standing 20 feet away from her son with the face of someone who has just heard a language he forgot he once spoke that was real too. A security guard was already moving toward them. The woman pulled Lucas closer and turned to go, her face burning, her breath short, every instinct in her body screaming the same word it always screamed when things went wrong. Run. Wait. Edward's voice, amplified by the microphone for just a moment before he stepped away from it, was not loud. It never needed to be. It had the quality of a sound that occupies every corner of the room it enters, and every person in the ballroom heard it as clearly as if he had spoken directly into their ear. The woman stopped. Her back was to him. Her hand was pressed against Lucas's head, holding him against her side. Don't, Edward said simply. He wasn't speaking to the security guard. He was speaking to her. Or perhaps to some other version of this moment, the one where she walked out the door and he never had to ask the question that was already forming in his chest like a slow, terrible pressure. Her shoulders rose with a breath she didn't let out. Edward stepped down from the stage. His footsteps were audible on the marble, measured, deliberate, and the crowd parted for him without discussion, the way crowds always parted for Edward Calloway. Out of habit, out of instinct, out of the deeply conditioned understanding that when this particular man moved in a particular direction, you did not stand in his way. He stopped 6 feet from them, close enough to see the boy's dark hair, the curve of his jaw, the particular way his ears sat slightly too close to his head in the way of young children who have not yet grown into their faces. Something moved through Edward's expression. The room was too well-bred to lean forward, but every single person in it leaned forward. "What's your name?" Edward asked. His voice was careful, the voice of a man measuring distance. Lucas twisted his face out from his mother's apron and looked up at the billionaire. No fear, only the pure, uncomplicated courage of a child who has already decided that this moment matters more than anything else in his small life. "Lucas," he said. "Lucas Rafael Reyes." He paused, then added with the gravity of someone presenting credentials, "I'm 6. Edward's jaw tightened once, then released. His gaze moved just for a moment to the woman's profile. She still had not turned around. Her knuckles were white where they pressed against Lucas's shoulder. This was not the beginning of the story. It was the detonation point, the moment that everything laid carefully in place over 6 long years had been waiting to reach. And to understand how a 6-year-old boy ended up pointing at one of the most powerful men in the country and calling him daddy in front of 200 witnesses, you have to go back. Not far enough to make it simple, but far enough to make it true. Her name was Mia Reyes. She had grown up in the kind of neighborhood that people who own ballrooms do not drive through unless their GPS has made a catastrophic mistake, the east side of the city, where the buildings were old enough to have dignity and too broke to maintain it, where the corner stores stayed open late and the streetlights hummed a frequency you learned to sleep through. Her mother had cleaned offices for 30 years. Her father had driven a delivery truck until his back gave out. Neither of them had ever once suggested, through word or gesture, that their daughter's life was smaller than it should be. That was the particular grace of the Reyes household, the refusal to name the cage. Mia was sharp. Everyone said so. Her teachers said so. Her mother said so. The university scholarship committee said so when they offered her a full ride to study nursing at a school 30 miles from home. She went. She worked. She learned to draw blood from a vein on the first try, to read a patient's chart the way some people read a novel fast, hungrily, catching every detail before it had a chance to hide. She was good at it, not in the way of people who find their purpose and feel lucky, but in the way of people who discover they have a talent for keeping other people alive and feel the full weight of that responsibility from the very first day. She was 24 and in her 2nd year of clinical training when she met him. Not in a ballroom, not at a gala. In a hospital elevator, which is perhaps the most honestly democratic space that exists. No marble floors, no chandeliers, no careful social geometry, just a box of steel and fluorescent light where everyone waits the same way. He had been visiting someone on the 3rd floor. She had never known who. He was holding a coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other, and he carried on his face a look she recognized immediately, not grief, exactly, but its first cousin. The hollow exhaustion of someone who has just been reminded that money cannot fix everything. He held the elevator for her. She said thank you. He looked up. That was it. That was all it took. His name, he told her, was Edward. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't ask. He asked her what she was studying. She told him. He asked why nursing. She gave him the truth. Because the moment something goes wrong in a human body, someone has to know what to do next, and she had always wanted to be that person. He was quiet for a moment after that, and then he said that was the most honest answer to a career question he had ever heard. She laughed. He laughed too, and his whole face changed. They had coffee, then dinner, then 3 months of something that felt, from the inside, like falling towards something warm and solid instead of falling into empty space. She knew he had money. She was not naive. His car was the kind you did not accidentally own. His apartment, the one time she glimpsed it, carried the particular understated elegance of spaces where no expense has been spared and no one wants you to know it. But he never made her feel the distance between them. He asked her questions, and he listened to the answers. He called when he said he would call. He showed up, and for Mia Reyes, who had grown up learning not to expect that the things that felt solid would remain solid, that was everything. And then, very suddenly, he stopped. No argument. No confrontation. No honest ending. Just silence, and then a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, measured and pleasant, carrying the particular warmth of someone who has rehearsed their delivery many times before a mirror. She informed Mia that Edward's circumstances had changed, that he would not be able to continue their arrangement, and that she hoped Mia would understand and move forward gracefully. Arrangement. That word. The way it rearranged, in a single syllable, everything that had come before it. Reclassified it. Filed it neatly into something temporary and manageable and already concluded. Mia sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her student apartment for a very long time after that phone call. The coffee she had been making when the phone rang went cold on the counter. She did not cry. She had always found it difficult to cry over things she didn't yet understand, and she did not understand this. She replayed every conversation, every evening, every moment she could recall with the clinical precision of someone checking their own work for errors, and she could not find one. She was not a footnote in something that should have been a story. She knew the difference. 3 weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. She told no one. Not her mother, not yet. Not the university. Not the number she still had saved under a first name in her phone. The number she dialed twice in the middle of the night and disconnected before the first ring both times. She sat with the knowledge alone for 2 weeks, and then she made her decision with the same quiet finality she brought to every hard thing in her life. She would have this child. She would finish her degree. She would ask for nothing from anyone who had decided she was worth nothing. She would simply continue the way she always had, the way her mother had taught her without ever putting it into words. You plant your feet. You keep going. Lucas Rafael Reyes was born on a Tuesday in February, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, dark-haired, with ears that sat slightly too close to his head, and the exact particular arrangement of jaw and brow that Mia had spent the 6 months of her pregnancy trying not to look for in her own reflection, in the mirror, in her imagination. But it was there. It had always been there, patient and undeniable, waiting for him to grow into it. She finished her nursing degree. She did. 3 semesters, a newborn, student housing that barely qualified as shelter, and she crossed the stage with her diploma in one hand and a mental list of every favor she still owed to every person who had held Lucas while she studied. She passed her licensing exam on the first attempt. She was offered a position at the hospital across the city, decent pay, real hours, the beginning of something that looked like a future. She worked that position for 14 months before the ward restructured and the newest hires were let go in a single afternoon. No warning. No severance beyond what the law required. She sent out applications and received polite rejections. She tried a clinic that closed. She tried a private practice that turned out to be something other than what it advertised. The city did what cities do, it moved on without noticing her. By the time Lucas was 3, Mia had reconfigured her life into a shape she had not planned for but understood well enough. She cleaned corporate offices during the week, private residences when she could get them, event catering and hospitality work on weekends when the agency called and the pay was better. She was good at it, efficient, quiet, invisible in the way that service workers learn to be invisible in spaces where no one wants to be reminded that someone else is doing the work that makes their comfort possible. She kept her uniform clean. She kept her chin level. She kept the blue tin on the top shelf of her closet, behind a winter sweater, where a child who asked too many questions couldn't easily reach it. She had only told Lucas what she believed was enough for now, that his father was a good man who did not know about him. She kept it simple. She kept it as far from bitterness as she could manage, which was not always very far, but far enough that Lucas had not yet learned to carry it the way she carried it. That had been, she believed, one of the few things she had managed well. What she had not accounted for, what she could not have accounted for, because no amount of caution can fully contain a curious 6-year-old on a rainy Saturday afternoon, was the blue tin not being as far out of reach as she had believed. She found out about it 3 days before the gala. She came home from a day's shift to find Lucas sitting cross-legged on her bed, the photograph held carefully in both hands, examining it with the same absorbed expression he brought to his picture books about deep-sea fish and distant planets. He looked up when she came in. His face was not guilty. It was wondering, open and enormous in the way only a child's face can be when they have just found a piece of a puzzle they didn't know they were supposed to be solving. "Mama," he said quietly, "is this my dad?" Her throat closed. She sat down beside him and looked at the photograph, the one she had not looked at directly in nearly 5 years. The two of them at a waterfront, somewhere in early autumn, laughing at something out of frame. His arm around her shoulder. Her face tilted up toward his. The light falling across both of them in the golden particular way of late summer afternoons that feel, while you are in them, as though they might last forever. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "That's your dad." Lucas studied the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at her, and his expression had shifted into something she could not quite read, something too complicated for a 6-year-old's face, except that it was exactly the right complication for this particular 6-year-old on this particular evening. "Is he nice?" Lucas asked. Mia put her arm around her son and held him against her side. Outside the window, the rain had started again, tapping its patient rhythm against the glass. "He was," she said carefully. "I think he still is." She put the tin back on the shelf. She told herself she would find the right moment to tell him the rest of it, the whole complicated, heartbreaking, adult rest of it when he was older and could hold more of the weight without it crushing something essential. She told herself she had time. She did not know that on Friday morning, the agency would call with an urgent last-minute placement. A high-profile gala at the Harrington Hotel. Excellent pay. Formal catering. Please bring your own apron. She did not know she would say yes without asking the name of the client. She did not know that her neighbor Mrs. Dominguez would fall asleep in front of the television that evening, or that Lucas had memorized the name on the brass plate outside the ballroom from the brochure left on the kitchen table, or that a 6-year-old who has made up his mind about something can be very quiet about it right up until the moment he is not. She did not know any of this. And now here they stood in the center of all of it, in the glare of 200 pairs of eyes, while Edward Calloway looked at her son with an expression she could feel without seeing, the way you can feel a change in weather before the sky shows it. She turned around. Their eyes met for the first time in 6 years and 4 months. His face had changed the way all faces change under the weight of time and responsibility, a little heavier, a little more deliberate. But his eyes were the same. They had always been the same. The look in them now was not recognition. Not yet. It was something that lived just to the left of it. A question so enormous it had no words. Only the particular quality of silence that settles over a man standing at the edge of something he cannot yet name and already understands will change everything. Lucas pressed his small face against his mother's arm and looked up at the man across the marble floor. "Mama's picture," he said quietly, as if that explained the whole world. And in that ballroom full of people, it almost did. For a moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. Not the guests nearest the stage, not the security guard frozen mid-step, not the bartender who had been pouring a glass of Bordeaux when the word "daddy" had stopped his wrist mid-tilt. 200 people held their collective breath in the particular way of witnesses who understand, without being told, that they are watching something that does not belong to them and yet cannot look away. Edward Calloway had not moved either. He was still standing 6 feet from Mia Reyes, still holding the posture of a man who has walked towards something before thinking better of it, and found himself unable to reverse. His eyes had not left her face since she turned around. And Mia stood with her hand on Lucas's shoulder and her chin at a level that had cost her every quiet year since the last time she stood anywhere near this man, and did not flinch, though her heart was a fist slamming against the inside of her chest. It was the event coordinator who finally broke. A small, efficient woman in a headset who materialized at Edward's elbow with the practiced urgency of someone whose entire professional identity depends on things proceeding according to schedule. "Mr. Calloway, sir, the program your address to the guests the foundations." "Announcement in a moment," Edward said. He did not look at her. The coordinator looked at the room, then at Mia, then at Lucas, then back at the room, and made the only decision available to her. She signaled the string quartet. They lifted their bows with the professional courage of musicians who have learned to keep playing through anything, and a soft Brahms intermezzo filled the air, giving the guests something to pretend to listen to while they continued watching everything else. Mia leaned down and spoke quietly into Lucas's ear. "Come with me now. We're going to find your shoes, and we are going home." Her voice was level. Her voice was always level when she needed it most. "But Mama, now, sweetheart." She straightened and took a step toward the service corridor, keeping Lucas tight against her side, keeping her eyes on the floor ahead of her, keeping herself inside the particular discipline of forward motion that she had learned was the only reliable protection against things you could not afford to feel yet. "Mia." Her name in his voice was different from anything else in the room. It stopped her the way a single note can stop a piece of music, not because it is the loudest, but because it is precisely the right one. She stopped. Lucas's hand tightened around her fingers. She did not turn around immediately. She stood still for 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds she permitted herself to feel, briefly and completely, the full weight of what it cost her to be in this room, in this uniform, with this man saying her name. Then she folded it back up and turned around. "This is a private event," she said carefully. "I work for the catering company. My son followed me here without my knowledge, and I apologize for the disruption. We're leaving." Edward shook his head. A single, unhurried motion. "You're not leaving." He glanced at the security guard and repeated it with a quiet authority that was not a command so much as a statement of fact. "She's not leaving." "Sir," Mia said, and the formality of it, the deliberate distance of that word, seemed to reach him somewhere he didn't expect. His jaw tightened. "Don't," he said. "Don't call me that." Lucas looked up at his mother's face and then at Edward's, and with the unerring instinct of children who have been watching adults navigate impossible situations since before they could name what they were watching, he seemed to understand that something was happening between these two people that was larger than both of them, and that it was not going to resolve itself quickly. He sat down on the carpeted step and pulled his knees to his chest and waited with the patience of a child who has spent a great deal of his life waiting for adult conversations to land somewhere. It was precisely then that the crowd parted a second time, not for Edward, but for a woman who moved through it with the assurance of someone who has never once in her life had to ask for space. Victoria Calloway was 6 years older than her brother and a great deal more practiced at the world. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a column of dark green that cost as much as Mia made in 2 months, and she carried on her face an expression of pleasant, measured concern that could not quite decide whether it was performing sympathy or suppressing something else entirely. She placed one manicured hand briefly on a guest's arm as she passed an apologetic touch, a social absolution, and arrived at Edward's side with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to managing crises in rooms full of people who must not know they are watching one. "Edward," she said, voice warm and low, "the guests are getting restless. I think perhaps we should relocate this conversation to one of the private suites." Her eyes moved to Mia with an expression of polite incomprehension, the kind worn by people who have perfected the art of looking at someone as though seeing them for the first time while knowing exactly who they are. Mia looked at Victoria, and the world tilted, very slightly, on its axis. She had told herself, in the months and then years after that phone call, that she would not recognize the voice if she heard it again, that she had rebuilt enough of herself around the absence of that particular wound that it had sealed over, and she was no longer the woman who had sat on the edge of a narrow bed with a cold cup of coffee and tried to understand what she had done to deserve being rearranged out of someone's life. She had told herself this and mostly believed it. But a voice is not something the body forgets the way the mind tries to. It lives somewhere below argument, in the same territory as the smell of a hospital corridor, or the sound of rain on a particular window, or the specific quality of silence after a door closes for the last time. It lives in the body like a scar, measured, pleasant, rehearsed. Mia's breath went very quiet. Lucas felt his mother's hand change something in the quality of her grip, the way her fingers momentarily tightened around his, and he looked up from his knees at the tall woman in dark green. Children notice things that adults have learned to smooth over. He studied Victoria Calloway's face with the focused, unguarded attention of someone who has not yet learned that it is impolite to look directly at people who make you feel strange. "Mama," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular. It was Edward who caught the shift. He had been watching Mia's face the way a man watches something he is afraid to understand, and he saw the moment her expression changed, not visibly, not in any way the rest of the room would register, but in the particular subtle way that a face changes when it is working very hard to remain a face and not become something else. He looked at his sister, then back at Mia. "Do you know each other?" Victoria laughed a short, light sound, perfectly calibrated. "Of course not, Edward. I've never met this woman." Mia said nothing, but her silence had a shape, and Edward was a man who had built a career on reading the shapes of silences in negotiating rooms, and he felt this one like a change in pressure. Lucas reached into his front pocket. He had been holding it since he left Mrs. Dominguez's apartment, folded once, slightly crumpled at one corner, but intact. He unfolded it with careful hands and held it up toward Edward. The photograph, the waterfront, the autumn light, the two of them laughing at something out of frame. Mia's face tilted upward, Edward's arm around her shoulder. Both of them golden in the particular way of late afternoons that feel, while you are inside them, as though they might last forever. "I brought it," Lucas announced, "so you could see, so you'd know it was real." Edward took the photograph with hands that he kept deliberately steady. He looked at it for a long time. The Brahms continued in the background, patient and unaware. Then Edward looked up, not at Mia, not at Lucas, but directly at his sister. And something in Victoria's face moved. Not much. Not enough for the 200 guests who were pretending to listen to the string quartet to notice. But enough. "Edward," she said, her voice carrying just the slightest additional effort at warmth. "I really think we should step into a suite. There are press photographers at the edge of the room, and I want to speak with her," Edward said. Quietly. "Alone." He looked at a hotel staff member hovering near the pillar and said, "Could you bring the boy some juice, please? And sit with him for a few minutes." Then he looked at Lucas directly, and something in his expression softened into a register that Mia had not seen on his face since the hospital elevator. "I'm going to talk to your mom. Is that okay?" Lucas considered this with the gravity of someone accustomed to being consulted. "Will you bring her back?" "Yes," Edward said. "I promise." Lucas nodded once. It was the nod of someone granting provisional trust based on available evidence. He allowed himself to be guided toward a chair near the pillar, accepted the juice that appeared, and watched everything with the patient, absorbing eyes of a child who has spent 6 years being quietly excellent at waiting. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The room Edward led Mia to was a small lounge just off the main corridor, a staff waiting room. Really, plain in comparison to the ballroom, with 2 upholstered chairs and a low table and the particular stripped-back honesty of a space not designed to impress. Victoria moved to follow them. Edward turned at the threshold and looked at his sister with an expression that Mia, watching from slightly behind him, could not see, but Victoria could, and whatever it contained stopped her at the doorway as effectively as a wall. "Wait here," Edward said. He closed the door. For a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of the ballroom music came through the walls faintly, abstracted. Mia stood near the door, and Edward stood near the table, and the distance between them was not large, 6 feet, perhaps 7, but it contained 6 years and everything that had happened inside them. And that made it the kind of distance that cannot simply be crossed by walking. "Sit down," he said. "Please." Mia sat, not because she was told to, but because her legs, which had been operating on adrenaline for the last 15 minutes, registered a moment of gratitude for the instruction. Edward sat across from her. He placed the photograph on the table between them, not as an exhibit, but the way a person places down something they need to look at squarely to understand. I didn't know you were still in the city, he said. His voice was careful, the voice of a man picking his way across unfamiliar ground in the dark, testing each step before committing his weight. I've been here the whole time, Mia said. Even now, even in this room, her voice was level. She had spent 6 years growing that levelness like a skill, like a second language, and it had become so deeply habitual that she sometimes wondered whether it had swallowed the rest of her, the part that was allowed to tremble. Edward nodded slowly, as though this was a piece of information he was filing somewhere and would need to return to. I tried to reach you, he said. After. He paused. You were gone. Your number wasn't connecting. The hospital said you'd left the training program. Mia looked at him. I received a phone call, she said. About 3 days after you stopped returning mine. A woman. She told me your circumstances had changed. She told me you wouldn't be continuing. She used the word arrangement. She watched his face as she said it. I assumed you'd asked her to call. Edward went very still. I didn't ask anyone to call you, he said. The words came out flat and precise, the way words do when a person is trying to hold them steady against a current running fast beneath them. Mia held his gaze. She had played this possibility out in the privacy of her own head many times over 6 years, the possibility that the call had not been sanctioned, that she had not been discarded but removed, and she had always shut it down before it could grow into anything, because hope of that particular shape was the most dangerous kind. It did not behave. It did not keep to its boundaries. And she had Lucas to raise, and a life to maintain, and she could not afford the wreckage. What did she sound like? Edward asked. His voice was very quiet. Mia considered the question the way a person considers a door they have kept locked for a long time. Measured, she said finally. Warm, in the way that isn't warm. Like someone who has said a difficult thing many times and learned to say it so smoothly that the difficulty doesn't show. Edward's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, they were different. Something in them had resolved not into peace, but into the particular clarity that comes at the far side of something you did not want to understand. I see, he said. The 2 words sat between them like stones. Mia looked at the photograph on the table. I never planned for tonight, she said. I didn't know the gala was yours. He followed me. He found the picture 3 days ago. I don't know what he thought would happen. She paused. He's 6. He thought it would be simple. Children usually do, Edward said softly. Then, after a moment, the kind of moment where a person lifts something heavy and does not let themselves think too long about the lifting. When was he born? Mia looked at him steadily. February, she said. 6 years ago. The 14th. She held the number in the air between them and let him do the arithmetic himself, because she was not going to soften it, and she was not going to perform it for him, and she was not going to be anything other than exactly what she was, a woman who had carried this alone for 6 years and was still carrying it. Here, now, in a plain lounge with Brahms coming through the walls. Edward's hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were very still. He was doing the arithmetic. She could see it in the particular quality of his stillness, the way a person goes motionless when their mind is working very fast on something that is reshaping everything around it. I want to see him, Edward said. Properly. Just I want to look at him. They went to the corridor together. Lucas was where Edward had left him, perched on the chair with both hands around his juice glass, legs swinging, watching the far end of the hallway with the observant patience of a child who has learned that the interesting things usually happen at the edges of rooms. He looked up when they appeared in the doorway. Edward walked toward him and crouched down to eye level. The way the light fell in the corridor, the contrast was undeniable. The same jaw, the same particular arrangement of brow and cheekbone, and the ears, just slightly too close to the head in the way of the very young. It was not a resemblance you could argue with. It was simply a fact, standing there in a slightly too large button-down shirt with juice on its lip. Hi, Lucas said. Hi, Edward said. Lucas tilted his head. Are you sad? A little, Edward said. Why? Edward looked at his son's face for a long moment. Because I missed a lot, he said, and his voice broke on the last word just at the end of it, just barely, in the way voices do when a person has been holding something together for exactly as long as they can hold it. Lucas reached out and patted Edward's arm twice, with the serious, pragmatic tenderness of a child who has watched his mother cry and learned that the best thing you can do is simply be there, nearby, touching something so the person knows you have not gone anywhere. It's okay, Lucas said. You're here now. Edward looked down at the small hand on his arm and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not fall apart before it reached the air. It was precisely then, standing up from his crouch, that Edward saw his sister. Victoria had not gone back to the ballroom. She stood at the far end of the corridor, phone in hand, her posture straight, her expression the composed and calculating blankness of a woman who is rapidly rearranging the available facts into a version of events that she can manage. She had not heard most of what passed in the lounge, but she had been in the corridor long enough to see her brother kneeling beside a 6-year-old boy and understand that the architecture of the last 6 years had just developed a crack that no amount of pleasant management was going to seal. She met Edward's eyes across the length of the corridor. In 40 years of knowing her, he had learned to read the things she kept out of her face. The calculation, the adjustments, the subtle realignments of whatever story she was currently maintaining. He had always told himself it was simply how she was built: efficient, protective, occasionally ruthless in the way of people who love something too hard and have decided that love gives them the right to arrange the world on its behalf. He had always told himself that. Was it you? He said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the full length of the corridor with the quiet, terrible weight of a question that already knows its answer and is asking only because the answer needs to be spoken aloud, in the open, where it cannot be managed or filed or called something else. Victoria's chin lifted. Her composure did not break. She was far too practiced for that, far too skilled at the architecture of maintained surfaces. But something shifted behind her eyes. Something small and reflexive, the involuntary flinch of a person who has just been found where they were standing, after a very long time of believing they had not been followed. She said nothing, but in the corridor light, with Lucas's small hand still warm on Edward's arm, that nothing said everything. Victoria walked toward them the way she had always walked toward every difficult thing in her life, directly, without hurrying, as though pace alone could signal that she was not afraid. She stopped several feet away and looked at her brother with an expression that was composed and regretful and absolutely unyielding all at once. I did what I thought was necessary, she said. Her voice carried no apology, only the flat, practiced conviction of a person who has long ago decided that an action taken in love, however brutal, does not require remorse. You were 29. You had just taken over the company after Father's stroke. You were in no position to be distracted by something that wasn't, that couldn't. She stopped, then adjusted. I protected you. You decided for me, Edward said. Yes, Victoria said simply. Because someone had to. It was the wrong answer, spoken in exactly the right tone for what it revealed: the absolute absence of doubt, the sealed certainty of someone who has never once, in 6 years, lost a night of sleep over what she had arranged. She had made the call. She had removed the variable. She had moved forward, as she always moved forward, and she had never looked back, because looking back was for people who were not sure they were right. Edward looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Lucas, who was watching Victoria with the same careful, steady attention he had brought to everything since he arrived, taking in the shape of her voice, the way she held herself, the things she was and was not saying. Children carry a kind of moral sonar. They feel the wrong note long before they have the vocabulary for it. She has a cold voice, Lucas said quietly, to no one in particular. Even when it sounds warm. Victoria's composure shifted just slightly, just enough. The way a wall shifts before it falls, the fine internal settling that precedes collapse. Edward stepped between them, not aggressively. He simply placed himself where he placed himself, and the geometry of it was its own sentence. You're going to step back from the foundation board, he said to Victoria. His voice was very calm. Effective tonight. You can call it a voluntary transition. I will not make what you did public, not because you deserve that protection, but because this family has a 6-year-old boy in it now, and I will not let his arrival into this world be accompanied by a scandal that was never his to carry. He paused. But you will not be in a position to manage my life. Not anymore. Not ever again. Victoria's jaw tightened. For a moment, the surface held. Then it did not. Her eyes went bright, not with tears, exactly, but with the complicated anguish of someone who genuinely believed they were the hero of their own story and has just been shown, clearly and finally, that they were not. She said nothing more. She turned and walked back down the corridor, her footsteps measured to the last, The composed exit of a woman who will not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in public. She would have to do that somewhere private. That was her choice. It had always been about her choices. Edward turned back to Mia. She was standing with her hands loose at her sides, her expression the particular stillness of a person who has just watched a very old wound receive, at last, the acknowledgement it was owed, and does not quite know yet what to do with the lightness of that. She had not asked for any of this. She had not engineered it. She had simply shown up to work a catering shift, and her 6-year-old son had loved her enough to follow her into a ballroom and point at a photograph come to life, and the truth had done the rest. "I don't know where to begin," Edward said. "You don't have to begin anywhere tonight," Mia said. "It's enough that it's out." She glanced at Lucas, who had climbed down from his chair and was standing beside her now, one hand tucked into hers. "He needs to sleep. And I need—" She stopped, and for the first time, the levelness wavered. Not into tears, into something quieter than tears. Something that had been waiting 6 years for the space to exist. "I just need a minute." Edward nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card plain, with only a number handwritten on the back in ink. He held it out to her, and she looked at it for a moment before taking it, because she was a woman who had learned to be careful about the things she accepted. "No conditions on that," he said. "No arrangements. Just call. Whenever you're ready. If you're ready." He looked at Lucas. "He deserves to know his father." "And his voice went unsteady for just a breath. "I need to learn how to be one." Lucas tugged gently at his mother's hand. He looked up at Edward, and his expression was the open, unguarded face of a child standing at the beginning of something he does not yet have the words for, but can feel the size of. He extended his free hand toward Edward, small, deliberate, utterly serious. "You can walk us out," Lucas said, "if you want." Edward Calloway, who had addressed boardrooms in governments and the sharpest minds in 4 industries without once dropping his composure, looked at his son's outstretched hand and felt it dismantle him completely, quietly, and with great care. He took it. They walked down the corridor together, the 3 of them, past the muffled sound of the Brahms and the low murmur of the gala still unfolding in the grand room beyond. The chandeliers threw their light at the far wall. The orchids bloomed on tables no one was looking at anymore. And in the corridor, unhurried and unannounced, a small family moved toward a door and through it, into the evening air, where the city stretched out around them in all its ordinary, democratic noise, horns and footsteps, and the smell of rain coming in from somewhere to the east. This is what I want you to hold on to long after this story ends. Not the ballroom, not the confrontation, not even the photograph in the blue tin. What I want you to hold on to is a 6-year-old boy who had nothing but a crumpled picture and absolute certainty, who walked into a room full of power and money and all the forces that keep people in their proper places, and simply pointed and said, "That is my father, and I know it, and I am not afraid to say so." Mia Reyes did not raise a child who begged. She raised a child who believed. And in the end, that belief walked through a door that 6 years of silence, manipulation, and careful management had tried to keep sealed forever, and opened it so easily, it was almost like the door had always been waiting for someone small enough and brave enough to reach the handle. Some truths are too alive to stay buried. They find a way. They always do. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.